Ranking Member Collins, and all the members. Before I had the great honor of being a counsel for this committee, my young son asked me a question. He said, "Dad, does the president have to be a good person?" Like many questions by young children, it had a certain clarity, but it was hard to answer. I said, "Son, it is not a requirement that the president be a good person, but that is the hope. And it is not a requirement that the president be a good person. That is not why we are here today. That is not the issue. But the very document that created the awesome presidency and its powers that we have made clear it is a requirement that the president be a person who does not abuse his power. It is a requirement that the president be a person who does not risk national security of this nation and the integrity of our elections in order to further his own re-election prospects. It is a requirement that the president not be a person who acts as though he is above the law in putting his personal and political interests above the nation's interests. That is the lesson of the Constitution. That is the lesson of the founders. They were concerned that someone would be elected president who would use all the power of that office to serve his own personal interests at the expense of the people who elected him. They decided there needed to be a remedy because they had suffered the abuses of King George, where they had no remedy. The remedy they imposed was that if a president commits a grave offense, a high crime or misdemeanor, this body has the power to impeach that president. They wanted to ensure that a president could not serve his own interests over that of the nation. It flows from the very oath that all members of this body must take to support and defend the Constitution and bear true faith and allegiance to the same. That is why we are here today, and it is an unfortunate occasion that these proceedings are necessary. But the president's actions have left no choice. The founders were very clear in spelling out what they saw to be the greatest abuses that would raise the most concerns for our nation. They spelled them out as warning signals that if a president violated or committed one of these, that would be a reason to potentially impeach that president. They were abuse of power, betrayal of the national interest, corruption of elections. And what is so extraordinary is the conduct we're going to be talking about today of President Trump didn't violate one of these, but all three. First, the evidence is overwhelming that the president abused his power by pressuring Ukraine and its new president to investigate a political opponent. The evidence is overwhelming that the president abused his power by ramping up that pressure, by conditioning a wanted White House meeting and a needed military aid that had been approved in order to get that president to investigate a political rival. It is clear and overwhelming that in abusing that power, the president betrayed the national interest by putting his own political prospects over the national security of our country. It is clear that the president risked corrupting our elections by inviting foreign interference to knock out an adversary to help his prospects in re-election. It is why in debating the Constitution, James Madison warned that because the presidency was to be administered by a single man, his corruption might be fatal to the republic. And the scheme by President Trump was so brazen, so clear, supported by documents, actions, sworn testimony, uncontradicted, contemporaneous records, that it's hard to imagine that anybody could dispute those acts, let alone argue that that conduct does not constitute an impeachable offense or offenses. This is a big deal. President Trump did what a president of our nation is not allowed to do. It is why last week the constitutional scholar, Professor Michael Gerhardt, said, If what we're talking about is not impeachable, then nothing is impeachable. President Trump's actions are impeachable offenses. They threaten our rule of law. They threaten our institutions. And as James Madison warned us, they threaten our republic. Let me begin where we must, with the facts and evidence. First, it's important to understand why Ukraine was so important to our national security. Ukraine was under attack by its aggressive and hostile neighbor, Russia. They had already encroached on its territories. The Ukraine was at great risk that Russia would again take further territory or try. Europe had a stake in this, and so did we. I'm going to turn to an expert on this, Ambassador Taylor, who is one of the most highly decorated diplomats and recognized diplomats. For over 40 years, he served our country honorably, and he was appointed by President Trump himself to be in charge of the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine.
The Russians are violating all of the rules, treaties, understandings that they committed to that actually kept the peace in Europe for nearly 70 years. That rule of law, that order that kept the peace in Europe and allowed for prosperity as well as peace in Europe was violated by the Russians. It affects the world that we live in, that our children will grow up in, and our grandchildren. This affects the kind of world that we want to see abroad.
That is Ambassador Taylor explaining why Ukraine was so important and explaining why the president's actions so significantly risked hurting our national security, our national defense policy, and our national interest. Now, you've already heard there is significant proof that President Trump himself told the new president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, that he wanted him to investigate a political rival, former Vice President Joe Biden. And you'll hear a lot about that today. But that proof is only the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more events and meetings and contemporaneous text messages, emails, other documents that show this happened and happened exactly as it is alleged. And it is clear that in this scheme to pressure Ukraine to investigate a political rival, the person at the center of that scheme was President Donald Trump. The facts cannot be disputed. President Trump used the powers of government for a domestic political errand to put his political interests above that of the nation. I'm going to turn to another expert. I'm going to turn to Dr. Fiona Hill, the National Security Council Senior Director in the Trump administration, and she's going to explain what happened.
But it struck me yesterday when you put up on the screen Ambassador Sondland's emails and who was on these emails, and he said, these are the people who need to know that he was absolutely right, because he was being involved in a domestic political errand. And we were being involved in national security foreign policy, and those two things had just diverged.
And that tells you what the evidence shows. The president put his own domestic political interests over the nation's national security and foreign policy. A president cannot abuse his power to secure an election. He cannot do that at the expense of the American people. That is an impeachable offense. The president has tried to make excuses for his conduct, why it's not wrongful or corrupt or an abuse of power. But the truth holds together. It makes sense. It's consistent with the evidence. When someone is offering an excuse that is not true, it is not consistent with the evidence. It does not make sense. It cannot be squared with what the facts show. And you will see these excuses do not make sense. The facts are clear that President Trump put his own political and personal interests over the nation's interest. I'd like to go through what you are going to see about the president's scheme, and you're going to hear about today from the facts that we have. First, you're going to hear that President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, pushed Ukraine to open an investigation of his political rival. Mr. Giuliani, prior to the July 25th call, he made public statements that Ukraine should investigate the former Vice President Joe Biden. He tweeted about it, putting pressure on the new president. He went to Ukraine and later went again with the assist and direction of U.S. officials who were told to aid the president's personal lawyer on the president's behalf. You'll hear that President Trump told his aides that he was relying on for Ukraine that he wanted them to, quote, talk to Rudy. What you're going to hear is that his close advisors had just gotten back on May 23rd from the inauguration of the new president, President Zelensky. They told President Trump, we were impressed. He was elected on an anti-corruption platform, a reform platform. You should schedule a White House meeting. It's very important. This is very good for the United States. And the president's response was, talk to Rudy, who had been out there claiming what the Ukrainian president had to do was investigate his political rival. You'll hear that President Trump's advisors told President Zelensky that President Trump would not schedule the wanted White House meeting unless he announced a Ukrainian investigation of former Vice President Biden. There are documents, there's sworn testimony. This happened, and there is no question from the evidence that the president did this. And President Zelensky desperately needed a White House meeting, both to show Russia that the U.S. was still supporting Ukraine and for his own credibility as a new president. You'll hear then, to ramp up the pressure, what President Trump did is he told his agencies to withhold military and security aid that had been approved and was supposed to be released to Ukraine, hundreds of millions of dollars, in order to put more pressure on Ukraine. All the agencies involved, State Department, Defense Department, National Security Council, said it should be released, that it had been approved, it was going to be released, until President Trump personally stopped it. And again, contemporaneous evidence and documents show it and prove it. People said that they were shocked. Ambassador Taylor said he was in astonishment. Your witness said that it was illogical to do this, and the president never offered an explanation. But ultimately, it was discovered why he did it. Then on the July 25th call, President Trump explicitly told him he wanted him to do 2 Ukrainian investigations, one of a U.S. citizen and his political rival, and the other about the origins of interference in the 2016 election, some conspiracy theory that Russia, who all the intelligence agencies agreed interfered with the 2016 election, that maybe it was Ukraine. Again, another investigation intended to help the president politically. That is it. And you know the president cared about the investigations that would help him politically and not Ukraine and not the national security interest. And you don't have to take my word. I'm going to play something from David Holmes, who had worked in the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine and was speaking to Ambassador Sondland, who President Trump appointed. Ambassador Sondland had just come to the Ukraine on the 26th. He met with President Zelensky. He went to a restaurant with Mr. Holmes, the U.S. political affairs counselor in Ukraine. and he called President Trump on his cell phone, and Mr. Holmes could hear that call, and then he spoke to Mr. Sondland. Let's see what happened on July 26th, the day after that call.
I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
That is sworn testimony by David Holmes, who heard it from the president himself. And it was clear to everyone, the most experienced people in government, who Donald Trump himself appointed in their positions, they knew what was going on. Let's look at a text message from Ambassador Taylor around this time on September 9th. He said, as I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. Again, that is President Trump putting his own political and personal interests over the nation's interests to hold aid desperately needed by Ukraine in order to combat Russia and show the support. He did it to help his own campaign. Now, there have been excuses offered by the president. I'd like to briefly talk about those excuses. The first excuse offered by President Trump is that the aid was ultimately released, and President Trump met with Mr. Zelensky. We heard it today. The challenge with that, though, as an excuse, is the aid was only released after President Trump got caught doing this scheme. On September 9th, the committees of this House started their investigation and announced they were investigating his conduct with regard to Ukraine. 2 days later was when he released the aid. And there also was a news article, which we'll talk about in a moment, by the Washington Post on September 5th exposing his scheme. And it was only after that that he met with President Zelensky, not in the White House, but in New York. Another excuse offered: the president was motivated by general corruption concerns. And again, the evidence shows that is not true, that that's what caused him to withhold the aid. President Zelensky, in fact, was elected on an anti-corruption platform. He was a reform candidate. His own people told him again and again, President Zelensky is a hope. He's doing it the right way. They urged him to be supportive. On his call with President Zelensky on July 25th, President Trump ignored the talking points that were prepared to talk about corruption. He only wanted to talk about two things: the two investigations that helped him politically. Every intelligence agency unanimously supported releasing the aid to Ukraine. That was appropriate. They did a study, a corruption study. They said, release it. The White House never provided an explanation. The aid had already been approved, and it was not for any corruption issues that President Trump withheld it. The next is Ukraine was not pressured. And the argument about that is, well, today they haven't said they were pressured. Well, Ukraine was pressured then and still is pressured. They are desperately in need of the United States support as they battle the threat of Russia. So, of course, they have to be careful what they said. But contemporaneous documents, emails, texts from the Ukrainian officials themselves show the pressure they felt, showed they knew what the President Trump was doing, showed what they had to do. This is one from Bill Taylor to, again, Ambassador Gordon Sondland and Ambassador Kurt Volker. Gordon, one thing Kurt and I talked about yesterday was Sasha Danilek, a senior aide of President Zelensky's, point that President Zelensky is sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely an instrument in Washington's domestic re-election politics. They not only felt the pressure, they got the message. They were not going to get a White House meeting. They were ultimately not going to get military aid unless they furthered President Trump's re-election efforts. That is a corrupt abuse of power. Another argument that's made is that Trump never said quid pro quo. And what you're going to hear is on a call with Ambassador Sondland after a Washington Post article came out on September 5th, which we will look at. After that, there was a Washington Post article that came out that, again, exposed the Ukrainian scheme. Days after that, President Trump was on a phone call with Ambassador Sondland and without prompting said there was no quid pro quo because he got caught. So he's offering his defense. But even Ambassador Sondland in his sworn testimony didn't buy it because ultimately then President Trump not only was not dissuaded, he again described what he wanted. He didn't want Ukraine to actually conduct these investigations. He wanted them to announce the investigations of his political rival, to help him politically. He continued, and you'll hear more about that. Again, none of these excuses hold any water, and they are refuted by testimony, contemporaneous records, and more. Now, some have suggested that we should wait to proceed with these impeachment proceedings because we've not heard from all of the witnesses or obtained all the documents. But the reason we have not heard from all the witnesses or documents is because President Trump himself has obstructed the investigation. He's directed his most senior aides who are involved in some of these events not to come testify, to defy subpoenas. He has told every one of his agencies with records that could be relevant not to produce those records to us, to try to obstruct our investigation. Now, this is evidence that President Trump is replaying the playbook used in the prior Department of Justice investigation. In that investigation, he directed his White House counsel to create a false, phony record and document and lie, denying that President Trump had told him to fire the special counsel. He did many other things to try to interfere with that investigation. He attacked the investigators and witnesses and called them horrible names, just as he has done here. And President Trump thought he got away with it. On July 24th was the day that the special counsel testified before this committee and the House Intelligence Committee. The 24th. It was exactly the following day, the 25th, that President Trump spoke to President Zelensky in furtherance of his Ukrainian scheme. He thought he got away with it. Not only that, he thought he could use his powers to interfere with that investigation. So he could do what he wanted. He could act like he was above the law. And if he got caught, he would again use his powers to try to obstruct the investigation and prevent the facts from coming out. And that's exactly what he did. But fortunately, because of the true American patriots who came forward to testify despite the threats by President against the people who worked in his own administration, they told the story. They, on their own, produced documents that provide uncontroverted, clear, and overwhelming evidence that President Trump did this scheme. He put his political re-election interests over the nation's national security and the integrity of its elections. He did it intentionally. He did it corruptly. He abused his powers in ways that the founders feared the most. No person in this country has the ability to prevent investigations, and neither does the president. Our Constitution does not allow it. No one is above the law, not even the president. And one of the concerns and requirements of finding an impeachable offense, is there an urgency? Is there a sense that you have to move because it could be repeated? Well, again, first, all the constitutional experts who testified recognized that obstructing an investigation is an impeachable offense. But here, the offense we're talking about that's being interfered or obstructed with is interfering with this very election that's coming up. And I submit to you, given what happened with the Department of Justice investigation, given what's happening here, if in fact President Trump can get away with what he did again, our imagination is the only limit to what President Trump may do next or what a future president may do next to try to abuse his or her power to serve his own personal interest over the nation's interest. I'd like to turn back to what the founders most cared about when we talk about the ABCs of potential presidential abuses. It is extraordinary that the president's conduct was a trifecta, checking all three boxes. Let's begin with abuse of power. What that means, it's to use the power of the office to obtain an improper personal benefit while ignoring or injuring the national interest, or acts in ways that are grossly inconsistent with and undermine the separation of powers that is the foundation of our democratic system. Now, this question of whether a president engaged in abuse of power came up before, when this Congress considered the impeachment of President Nixon. And after action was taken, President Nixon famously said, if the president does it, it is not illegal. And this body rejected that because that's not so. That goes directly contrary to what the founders said. But President Trump has said the same thing in responding to the prior investigation by the Department of Justice and defending his conduct. Here's what he said.
Then I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president.
That he has the right to do whatever he wants as president. That is as wrong as when President Nixon said a similar thing. That is not what the Constitution provides. That is not what the country demands. He does not have the right to do whatever he wants. Turning to the second abuse of power I'm most concerned, betrayal of the nation involving foreign powers. The American people have suffered that foreign influence when President Trump treated military aid that had been approved, taxpayers' dollars, and decided to treat it as his own checkbook to try to further his own re-election chances. That reflects what the founders were concerned about. And finally, corruption of our elections. The framers knew that corrupt leaders, or leaders acting corruptly, concentrate their powers to manipulate elections and undercut adversaries. They talked about it frequently. That is why the framers thought electoral treachery, particularly involving foreign powers, was a critical abuse and that could support and lead to impeachment. Now, the American people learned last election how dangerous foreign intervention in our elections can be. Let me show another clip from candidate Trump on the campaign trail.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
And Russia was listening. Within approximately 5 hours of President Trump's invitation to Russia to interfere in our election by trying to hack and obtain the emails of his political opponent. Russia, in fact, tried to do that for the first time. The very officers who were then indicted by the Department of Justice for that conduct, they took candidate Trump's invitation. Now, the American people learned a lesson. President Trump, unfortunately, apparently learned a different lesson. Let's look.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. They should investigate the Bidens.
So this was President Trump answering a question about what did he want President Zelensky to do. So even after he got caught, he is saying, again, this vulnerable nation, dependent on U.S. support militarily and otherwise, again, he's telling them what to do. And unlike in 2016, when he only had a campaign platform, which to extend the invitation to a foreign power, now he has the levers of government in his control to not only request it and invite it, but to pressure that country to do it. And that's exactly what he did, and you'll hear more about that in the presentation from the House Intelligence Committee. And what's most striking as we come back to this issue that the framers were concerned about, is there a continuing risk of wrongdoing? The fact that President Trump did this after he was caught shows the risk of what will happen if this body doesn't act. He really does believe he can act as though he were above the law. He really does believe, as evidenced by this conduct, that he can put his personal and political interests over the nation's interest, over the nation's national security interest, over the nation's integrity of its elections. So, of course, we do have an election coming up. That's not a reason to postpone this discussion. That's a reason we must have this discussion, to make sure it is not interfered with, to make sure this president doesn't do it, to make sure future presidents do not do it. It is the hope that in these discussions, we can put aside political rancor, disagreements, and have a fair discussion about the facts and this conduct, not just as it relates to President Trump, but as to the presidency itself and future presidents. My son, our children, our grandchildren, they will study this moment in history. They will read all of your remarks. They will learn about all of your actions. And that is not a reason to vote for or against impeachment. For that, of course, you must vote your conscience. But that is a reason for us to have a fair debate about what the undisputed facts show, to recognize that it is wrong, it is very wrong, and it cannot happen again with this president or any president. It is a reason to talk about whether we want our children and grandchildren to live in a country where the president elected by the people can put his own personal and political interests over the interests of the people who elected them. It is a reason for these debates to, again, fairly focus on the facts and to make sure the presentations we're going to hear will not distort the record, focus on process points, raise extraneous matters that really are intended to distract rather than focus on what the conduct was at issue here. It is a reason to focus on the facts and what is in the country's best interest. History, future generations will be the judge.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Thank you, Mr. Burke. Mr.